Alrighty, this video is going to be brainstorming about the kind of things that I can include in my article. So I'm going to be writing for an academic journal called Alternative Roots, and it has something to do with justice and social science. I forgot the full name of the journal. But what Jeff wants me to do is write on anything that has to do with social justice. And when I was talking to Jeff, I realized that the whole point of taking philosophy at 57 was because I was getting really disillusioned with the politics in the Aboriginal community. It's really taken a turn towards militancy, extreme identity politics, and so forth. And it's becoming almost an exclusionary feeling to who's who in the Indian zoo or the Aboriginal zoo, right? And that's what bothers me. That's what really, really bothers me. So I want to talk, I think the first thing I'm going to do in the article, right, is talk about my experience for 40 years, what's happened. So in the 1970s, the whole concept of the Indigenous struggle was really about gaining equality within a Canadian system. Very narrow, very focused and limited view of our struggle. What we were looking at, there were two really opposing views. One was Pierre Trudeau's small L liberal concept of the system itself, the Canadian system itself, is not the problem. The fact is that there is a lack of representation of people from the Native community in the parliament system, and that's why the Native people always get left behind. So what he was promoting is that we don't need special rights. What we need is access to the decision making and sharing in the power of this country. Very similar to Betty Friedan and her work in the 1960s, which was very progressive for that time. And that was the world, the system, the patriarchal system is not the problem. The problem is that there's not too many women participating in owning and influencing the patriarchal system. So what Betty was saying is that if you have more women in the system, then the system will adjust. So that was one view. The other view was written by Harold Cardinal, and he wrote a book called The Unjust Society, and it was a direct response to Pierre Trudeau's Towards a Just Society. So those were the two kind of guiding and opposite poles of the spectrum. And in my case, and in my mother's case, we kind of lean towards Trudeau. But since then I've changed, my mother's passed on, but I've changed, and I'm leaning towards Harold Cardinal these days. So that was the 70s, and I think that really describes the kind of things that we were doing. And then there's what I call, kind of a midterm between what I believed then and what I believe now, in terms of what the nature of the struggle was about. The nature of the struggle in the 70s was about equality within a domestic scenario. The middle step for me was a realization that it's not the lack of participation in a given system that's the problem. The problem, and this is very old packaging now, the problem that we realized in the 1980s, or that I experienced, or that I realized in the 1980s, was that it was the system itself that was the problem. It was within the nature of colonialism, It was in the nature of power to exercise that power, to control it, but more importantly, to maintain power. And you could see that in many, many ways through the generations. Well, because, for example, a lot of what is popular now is just a reinvention of the things that we fought and supposedly won in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. So the shift for me was we need to be equal within a system. The middle ground was that the system itself is a problem. And then the last part of my evolution in terms of my understanding what the struggle is for Indigenous people is it's not just one system that's the problem. It is a system that is becoming entrenched on a global basis. So globalization, the advance of technology, social media, and all of those kind of things are now playing into the factor, and more people are involved, which is good. The problem is not all people have sat down, experienced, thought about, reflected on the nature of what the Indigenous struggle is. So now more and more we have the kind of concept to be, that says to be an Aboriginal person. These are the group of political commitments that you have to sign off on in order to be a real Native person. And that's called identity politics. And then some people who subscribe into identity politics take it a step further and enforce the fact that if you don't agree with what the identity politics says that we're supposed to agree to, then we get you fired, we get you removed. We find a way of allowing you not to say what you're saying. So it is an enforcement through confrontation, through whatever, that says you're not allowed to think that. You're not allowed to say it. And if you do think it, you're not allowed to say it. And so there's some very dangerous seeds happening in the Indigenous struggle. So that's one part of the equation and part of the issues that I'm worried about. The other part is that the struggle, the Indigenous struggle has really moved from, like what I said in the 70s, about an equality issue within a given system, moving through the fact that maybe not, maybe it's the system itself is the problem, to where we are now. Now, having mentioned identity politics and the dangerous militancy out there, the beautiful part of this whole thing is that the Indigenous struggle is not just for Indigenous people anymore. It's about fighting for the rights to be human, fighting for the rights to survive, fighting for the planet, and so forth. So the Indigenous struggle really is one of finding a voice that is true to who we are as Aboriginal people, yet can be applied as a leadership model in terms of sustainability. And I think that that is something that's naturally happening. I know in philosophy, as an example, the only place Indigenous philosophy or Indigenous knowledge or thought is taken seriously is within the field of environmental philosophy, which says a lot in itself. So I'm going to end this video summarizing the 3 stages that I went through in terms of my own understanding of the Indigenous struggle. First phase, 70s and 80s, was about equal rights for Indigenous people within a system where we are underrepresented. Towards the 80s and 90s, 80s and 90s, we began to realize that, wait a minute, we have more Native people involved in the system and it's not changing, it's becoming more complicated. What's going on? So perhaps there's something in the system, the nature of a system of power, that is a problem. And the problem is simply that power does not give itself up easy. It just it gives a little bit of capital away, but it reinvents itself to get more capital back. We see that in the increased gap between the extremely rich and the rest of us. And then the final one is, it is still systematic, but it's not just a system of one country. It's not just a system of one nation state. Nation states are ideas that are becoming vastly dated and not helpful in trying to understand the nature of Indigenous struggle. So the nature of Indigenous struggle now is global. It is not just for Native people anymore, it's for humanity. It's for the survival of a humanity through the proposition of our proposals, the proposals of our philosophy, to talk about cohesiveness, to talk about interconnectivity, to talk about finiteness, the fact that the earth is limited towards what it can provide. And so now I think that the Indigenous struggle is A, about equality within our system, 2, it's about changing the system, but now it's evolving towards using what we have to offer to contribute to the world, to contribute to society, and say, this is perhaps the road we got to take. Sustainability requires a mindset of connectivity. And I think that's where the struggle is right now. And I think that progression of the struggle is a good thing. The problem is, of course, that there seems to be a group of Aboriginal people who want to own that progress, want to control that progress, want to use militant political identity strategies, moves, to enforce a very finite view of humanity, of Indigenous people. And thirdly, they're supporting political objectives that are contrary to traditional beliefs. And so these activists, these militant political identity people, well-meaning people, good people, heartfelt people, honest people, but people who, in good intention, they're not trying to do this on purpose to get us towards legitimizing, but what they are doing, what I need to do more thinking about in my research on the nature of resistance, is the fact that, when you try to narrow and keep people focused on a set of objectives that define your identity, you're silencing a lot of other stuff. You're silencing a lot of emerging thinking. You're silencing a lot of potentially growth areas that we need to do. And what we're doing through employing militant political identity strategies is simply justifying colonialism, because we are now the colonialists. We are the ones who decide, this is what you will think about Indian people. And to the Aboriginal people, this is how you will limit your reality. And that's the inherent problem that is just at a very infant stage right now. And I think that we need to be addressing that in philosophy. I think we need to be addressing that in Indigenous studies. We need to include that as part of the conversation around the indigenization of the university, and really of finding our place among equals, because God created all of us. We're no better than white people, they're no better than us. We're all brothers and sisters, and we should be connected if we're going to be true to our philosophy. We are connected to human beings who are connected to the earth, but we're not necessarily connected to racist ideologies that come with people. We're not connected to reverse discrimination or reverse racism or reverse supremacism that come inherent and intrinsic in certain rhetorical thinking within the politics of our community. So that's the first part of the article that I want to cover. And so I'll leave it at that.